Okay, this is probably one we have been anticipating. We're going to be talking about all of the changes coming to League of Legends esports in 2025, the good, the bad, and the ugly, and I'm going to be giving my thoughts on them. A lot of interesting changes in here, can provide a lot of interesting context around some of it. Um, and we'll start off with the stuff that I think was actually good. Just get it out of the way, and then we can dive into the bad stuff. I used to work as an analyst for an amateur team back in 2016 when promotion and relegation was a thing in the LCS. And so I'm super excited to see promotion and relegation back in the LCS. I think that's a really good change that they've made. I also started my own team recently within the last year or two when they announced that you could have promotion and relegation into the Challenger League here again, which is something that hasn't existed since I worked for that other team back in 2016. And so we did have a team play in that, and they went 2-3. Palisade Esports. They could have done a little bit better. I should have done a little bit better of a job coaching them maybe, and we would have squeaked out that one extra win we needed to make it out of the group stage of that. But nevertheless, we gave it a shot. I've just been too busy to continue to do that, so we just did it the one split with that team. But I've been involved with the scene, and I know how it's been, and been playing since season 2, kind of the tail end of season 2. Started playing ranked in season 3, so I can provide a lot of context to the history of how the LCS has been run and the way the international league esports scene has been. And so we're going to dive into all of that because a lot of the ecosystem is completely changing and being uprooted this year. And we're going to talk about whether these decisions make sense or whether they are going to kill the esport. So, the other change that they're making that's good that we can just get out of the way really quickly is they're adding a third international event, I think, at the start of the year. And that is going to be quite good because I think MSI and Worlds are not enough for international events. I've been wanting more international competition, and that's something we're going to talk about here because I think actually some of these other changes are unfortunately going to curb some international competition. But I think that that's a good event that they're adding and should be fun. Of course, we used to have an All-Stars event where players in regions get to vote for their favorite player in each role. So viewers and fans got to vote on their favorite player in each role, but it was kind of a for fun tournament because you had random different players from different teams who weren't used to playing with each other, representing the region. And so it was kind of a for fun tournament, but it was different, interesting spin on things. To be honest, in my personal opinion, I'm glad they added another serious tournament, even if it's a little bit smaller. I'm glad they added another serious tournament instead of bringing All-Stars back. But I would definitely like to see something like All-Stars come back as well, always for more international competition. And I think at this point, with 3 serious competitions now, for a 4th one, they might want to bring something like an All-Stars format back for that. So those are the changes that are good out of the way for the most part. So then we get into the kind of controversial things that are going to really shake things up. So the current league international esports ecosystem works like this. You have major regions and minor regions. And for major regions, we have China, Korea, NA, and EU, of course. And then for minor regions, we have like Taiwan, Vietnam, the CIS, which is Commonwealth of Independent States. It's like Russia and Eastern European countries, Turkey, Oceania, Japan, like Hong Kong, Macau, but they're kind of tied in with Taiwan, and like Latin America and Brazil. And we used to have Latin America North and Latin America South. The way that it would work is the major regions would get a certain number of guaranteed spots at international events like MSI and Worlds. And the minor regions would play in like a play-in phase, and the top 1 or 2 teams would get to be the wildcard representative from a minor region at MSI or Worlds. Generally speaking, the format's slightly changed over the years and things like that. Major regions have like gained or lost spots depending on how well they've been doing or how poor they've been doing. And the minor region teams, the number and things like that, and the regions themselves have changed a little bit over the years. But generally speaking, that's about how the league ecosystem worked. We're about to experience some huge changes here because what they're proposing, or what they're going to do, is the NALCS, which was a major region but the worst performing major region of the four major regions, is going to be combined with Brazil and Latin America. And then in Southeast Asia, Taiwan and Vietnam, which were like the best wildcard regions, are going to be combined with Japan and Oceania and Hong Kong and Macau to form essentially a major region out of a bunch of minor regions. And then as far as Turkey and Russia's CIS, I have no idea what their role is in this new ecosystem. So here's our first problem: is for Russia, the CIS, and Turkey, this may, depending on the format, as far as we know so far, this may just be the end of international esports in league for the time being for Turkey and for the CIS, which I think is a shame, because if I had to rank the wildcard regions of those eight wildcard regions, I would say Vietnam was number one, Taiwan is number two, and then Russia, the CIS, right? Turkey and Brazil are kind of in a tier together, kind of indistinguishable below Vietnam and Taiwan. And then Oceania and Japan and Latin America are kind of in a tier together below Brazil, Turkey, and Russia. And, so that's a shame, because you're taking like probably the third and the fourth best, roughly speaking, regions, and I think potentially just completely eliminating their international competition, like their ability to compete in international competition in the esport, as well as probably just, if you're getting rid of most of the point or the finale basically, or the goal of having that region, maybe there'll be, some tournament play or something like that, but I don't even know what the point of those leagues existing would be if they can't qualify for these international events, because that's kind of what all these leagues lead to, is these international events. Now, for the other minor regions, especially the ones that aren't very good, the lack of a play-in stage, and instead of having to qualify through either the Southeast Asian Conference or this North American League Conference, is, I think, worse. And so let's talk about why. So let's say you're Japan, Oceania, or Latin America, which is now, we've got two minor regions that are basically completely gone as far as I'm aware. And these three are getting gutted. They all probably had, probably 6 teams or 8 teams or 10 teams, depending on the region. And now they're going down to, for Latin America, down to 2 teams total. And I would assume something similar for Oceania and Japan. So maybe they get 2 teams. Maybe they're down to 1 team out of their entire league. So their entire league has just been decimated, literally, down to 1 team from maybe 10. That means that all of those players who were professional players that people were fans of, gone, not able to do it anymore. All of the coaches, staffs, organizations, even investors, right, who have put time and money into these things, it's just all blown up overnight by a decision from Riot like this. So that's absolutely nuts to me. Then we talk about, like, okay, well, what about, sure, it's changing, but like for those teams that are still there, and yes, these minor regions that didn't have a lot of competition were top heavy, and it was like mostly the one top team was like winning over and over again, but not necessarily, right? Like Oceania saw like multiple different teams. Japan's been pretty dominated by one team, but Oceania saw multiple different teams. They were back in the day like dominated by the Chiefs, but they've seen multiple teams come out to international competitions as well. So, anyways, so is there going to be more international competition though as a result of this change? And sort of, but sort of not, right? So like for Oceania and Japan, they get to play against each other, they get to play against Taiwan, and they get to play against Vietnam more frequently. However, they don't really ever get to play against like Russia or Turkey ever again. They don't really get to play against Latin America ever again, or Brazil ever again, or NA, or EU, or China, or Korea, because their odds of getting out over Vietnam and Taiwan, which are like just straight up superior regions, right? Mostly not like a thing to hate on those regions or whatever, mostly due to player base and things like ping and stuff like that. There's a lot of reasons why these regions are better. The number one factor is simply the number of people in the region playing the game, because it creates more competition that causes like the best players that develop out of that group of people to be just much better if there's more people trying. And so that, I mean, that's even why like Korea is better than, than like NA as an example, is because Korea's got 4 times the number of people playing the game. So you get into stuff like that, right? But anyways, so there's sort of more international competition for them, except they never actually get to compete against all those other regions, because the only way they'd make it to Worlds, since there's doesn't sound like there's going to be any sort of play-in stage, the only way they'd make it to Worlds at all, or MSI, the only way they'd make it is if they manage to beat out the Taiwanese and Vietnamese teams, which have way more players playing the game and are just clearly superior regions. So in my opinion, they've essentially just buried Japanese and Oceanic League of Legends esports permanently, because I think it's going to be like maybe a once in a decade type of event where one of those teams somehow manages to win the conference and break out. In which case, right, they're going to get like a little bit of international play versus only 3 other regions for the one time that they actually do manage to make it, because they're going to play in their group at Worlds with only 3 other regions. And then they're just going to get crushed at Worlds and not make it out. So I think it's rather depressing for Oceanic and Japanese esports, league esports as well, especially considering, again, their player base, their teams, their orgs, just all decimated. And then same situation over here in the North American League with Latin America. Latin America went from a lot of teams down to just these 2, and they're going to be hard pressed to get out of either of these conferences to make it to Worlds either. And so yes, they get to compete against LCS and against Brazil a little bit more often than they would, but they're probably never going to get a chance to play versus any of the major regions at an event, because they'd have to actually get a spot over the Brazilian team, the best Brazilian team, or over the best NA team. It's just not going to happen for them. Or, if it does, it's like a once, maybe even less than a once in a decade type of thing for Latin America over here, because they're competing with an actual major region. So it's pretty doomed for them. So again, you've taken now the Turkey, Russia. I don't even know what's happening with them. They haven't even said anything about them. They're just dead and gone. And you've got Latin America, Oceania, and Japan. Their esports scene is just completely gutted, to be clear. So that's terrible from those regions' perspective, right? So now let's get into the good stuff, right? What about NA? Well, NA, this may seem kind of interesting, right? Because I guess might seem kind of interesting, but it's actually really bad, because first off, we're going from 8 teams to 6 actual LCS teams, right? So we're losing 2 of the franchise orgs are pulling out of the league, is one of the things that this means. And we're also losing, because it says here, the Americas Regional Championship, to determine the 3 teams going to Worlds, at least 1 from each conference. So because at least 1 team has to come from each conference, it's not possible for 3 of the 6 teams from the Americas League going to Worlds to be the NALCS teams. Instead, one will be from the Southern Conference, meaning either the Brazilian team, which it will be the best Brazilian team, or the Latin American team, or a guest team from Tier 2 is like a challenge, one of the challenger teams that gets to promote and relegate into this league. I'm assuming this one in the South Conference has to come from Brazilian challenger, since I would assume they wouldn't want like an NALCS team to try to farm their way into the South Conference to try to get to Worlds. And then, we've got an NACS team who's going to make it into the North Conference or something like that, and they're also going to get crushed like the Latin American team. So we're losing a world spot. We're also losing an MSI slot because it says the top team from each conference go to MSI. So that's also minus an MSI slot. And there's not even a chance to prove that the third best NALCS team is better or not than the first best Brazilian team in this situation. They just don't ever get to play versus each other because the format, like they've written here, is specifically designed so that one team from each conference has to make it. So they won't even bother having like a best of 5 between like the third best LCS team and the top Brazilian team, so that you can see like, oh yeah, this Brazilian team's going to Worlds, but the NA team is better. You'll just assume that the Brazilian team is somehow better because they got to go to Worlds, and because their record will look better because they're playing against 5 other Brazilian teams, a challenger team, and a Latin American team, whereas the third best LCS team has to contend with the, like 4 other LCS teams and the Latin American team and the challenger team. So obviously the North Conference is a lot harder. So the third best team is going to have a lot worse record, right, in their conference than the first best team from the South Conference. But the third best team from the North Conference could still be way better than the first best team from the South Conference. So then we get into like the fairness aspect of it. If NA is going to lose a world spot, does NA deserve to lose a world spot, and who do they deserve to lose it to? This is a tough question because at the end of the day, if we wanted Worlds to be only purely about competition and the best teams getting the best slots, pretty much all the slots would be going to Korea and China. So at the end of the day, Worlds is an attempt to show NA and EU and Korea and China and Taiwan and Vietnam and Brazil and all of the regions that have the most viewership, right? It's an attempt to show international competition while not necessarily taking, like, let's say the 16 best teams in the world, but taking like the 3 best teams from China, the 3 best teams from Korea, the 3 best teams from NA, the 3 best teams from EU. And it used to be, like the best team from Taiwan, or like the 2 best teams from Taiwan and 1 wildcard region or something like that, right? It's, you want to have a mix of like the best teams and international play from a bunch of different representatives of a bunch of different regions. So on the one hand, that's true, right? On the other hand, does NA deserve to lose a world spot? NA's world's performances of late have been pretty abysmal. However, if you compare NA's record, right, in group stage, their win-loss and all this stuff over time, to any wildcard region, obviously NA is outperforming wildcard regions at Worlds. So if you take away a spot from LCS and give it not to Korea, China, or EU, if you give it to like one of the wildcard regions like Vietnam or Taiwan even, it doesn't really make sense because NA's been outperforming Vietnam and Taiwan at MSI and Worlds for a while, like for literally the entire history. So it doesn't really make any sense to take a spot away from NA and give it to another region like that. Well, then when you get into it, okay, from a competitive standpoint, if you do take a spot away from NA, who do you give it to? Again, as I said, Vietnam is the best minor region. And then Taiwan's the second best minor region. So maybe we should go back to that format we had before where, that Southeast Asian conference, has more representatives at Worlds because they're the best, like, minor region, or they're basically another major region. But giving it to Brazil doesn't really make any sense because, as I said before, I kind of see Brazil as like worse than Vietnam and Taiwan, but on the same level as like Russia and Turkey. But Russia and Turkey are just gone and don't get to compete with Brazil anymore. And even though Taiwan and Vietnam are arguably better than Brazil, they don't get a chance to take the spot away from Brazil. Instead, Brazil just gets a free spot at Worlds, and NA just loses a spot at Worlds, despite the fact that yes, there's Korea and China at the top, and then a gap between Korea and China and EU, and then a gap between EU and NA. But there is a huge gap between like NA and Vietnam, or NA and Taiwan, or especially NA and Brazil. So the idea that like the gap between EU and NA, for example, is probably smaller than the gap between NA and Brazil. So to take a spot away from NA and give it to Brazil doesn't really make any sense from a competitive standpoint. It only makes sense from the perspective of Brazil is a growing and rising region in terms of viewership, and they want those Brazilian fans to be watching Worlds and to be able to actively participate at Worlds as almost a mini major region or whatever that's guaranteed a spot, because Worlds is, again, I guess from the perspective before, more of about showing international play, showcasing international play. And so we're going to give Brazil a spot no matter what, so we can always see a Brazilian team at Worlds stacking up against other teams. And that could be okay. It just sucks that the spot comes from NA, and that there's no chance for NA or Vietnam or Taiwan to take the spot away from Brazil. Now, maybe this will change if it starts to become obvious that the third best team from the LCS is just way better than the first best Brazilian team, or if the first best Brazilian team always goes to Worlds and gets blown out or whatever. But we'll have to wait and see on that one, I guess. So for Brazil, this is a great change, although even for Brazil, I think they lost some teams here. But this is a great change because they're guaranteed a world slot. So like obviously for them, the level of international competition is maxed out because they're getting to play against Latin America and LCS all the time, as opposed to just playing in Brazil. And they're pretty much guaranteed a world spot if they can manage to beat a random challenger team and a random Latin American team. And an MSI spot. So like that's huge for them. So I guess they just get to go to those events for free and nobody can challenge the spots. The only way to contest these spots at this point is over a year or 2 years or 3 years. The other regions are just going to have to beat them up internationally so bad that Riot feels like they've got to change the whole system around again and give a different region a chance or the spot instead. But it's just, it is pretty disappointing if you're an NA fan because you're losing an MSI and a world spot. There's going to be less international competition, at least with the regions you care about competing with. There will be more international competition against Latin America and Brazil, but I don't think NA fans are really looking forward that much to like NA playing Latin America. I think NA fans are more interested in NA playing against the big Korean teams, the Chinese teams, the EU teams, especially as rivals, right? Like that's what we're more interested in. Some of the Brazilian teams and players are kind of fun, but again, then you also run into like this other big issue with running the leagues like this is now you've got Portuguese, Spanish, and English, and where are the players going to be playing out of? And are you going to draw players out of their solo queue ladders in their native regions, thus like weakening already super weak solo queue ladders of these minor regions that have no one playing in them, because you're like getting all the Latin American players to like move to LA or Brazil or something like that. And then you've got the, like I said, the broadcast in 3 different languages. Same thing with, but maybe even worse, in the Southeast Asian League. Where are they going to play? Are they going to all have to move to like Vietnam or Taiwan or something like that? Is that going to draw all of those players out of their native solo queue ladder and make their already weak solo queue ladders worse? Like you're killing all the careers of like literally maybe 100 pro players across the world here with these changes. And then you're also talking about like, broadcasting in Japanese, English for Oceania, Vietnamese for the Vietnamese teams, and like a Chinese version for the Taiwanese teams, so / Hong Kong. so we got like 4 languages going on in that region, and then this has always been a problem for league, and this is why I don't understand why they don't just constrain this to like a language or a region, is you advertisers, right, want to advertise to a targeted demographic. And one of the things that's always benefited NALCS is that if you're a company and you want to advertise to like an English speaking American and Canadian audience or whatever, you can just advertise on the LCS and it's there. One of the problems with EU is that they speak German, Italian, Spanish, English, all these languages, Polish, whatever. So they speak all these languages, and it's kind of hard to advertise because you need to be a company that either sells to all of these countries, or it's not really worth it to you because you're like a German company only trying to advertise to the Germans watching, but you're paying for all these eyeballs from other languages that don't even understand your ad or like what's going on. So advertising has always been really complicated for these multicultural leagues or whatever, or multilingual leagues, and you're making it worse for NA, which was actually the one region that had like the language cohesion for advertising down. Now you've got Portuguese, Spanish, and English in the same, broadcast, and they tried to spin this, and they said that it was going to be less confusing to follow the LCS now that there were 6 teams instead of 8. So they were trying to spin the losing teams thing as a good thing. Except now there's actually kind of 16 teams, and they speak 3 different languages, and there's challenger teams involved now too. And we don't know any of the Latin American or Brazilian players except for like the one BRTT guy from Brazil, and I don't even know if he plays anymore, to be honest with you. And then the, challenger teams and players we're not going to know. So, and you've still got all the imported players in the NALCS that speak Korean and stuff like that. So of the 6 teams, which is only 30 remaining NA professional players, probably half, if not more, are foreign international players, import players. And so we're looking at like 15 native NA players, professional players total in all esports, all esports. So honestly, I think that these changes, as you can imagine after hearing these thoughts, these changes are really rough for NA fans and for native NA talent. And I'm really disappointed to hear that they're moving in this direction. I've always been saying, even though it sounds unrelated when we were talking about the import stuff years ago, that in order to get viewership up, they need to have an English-speaking, actual American and Canadian players that are like relatable to the people who are playing the game and watching the LCS. They need to lean into the broadcast being more of an esports, like lighthearted, joking esports environment rather than pretending it's a professional sports broadcast. They've tried to move in that direction, which is good, and hopefully they get better at it. Maybe it's just the broadcast talent, but it's been coming across. Sometimes it's been hitting. They're getting better at it, but it's been coming across pretty cringy sometimes when they try to be genuinely authentic and get back to their like esports roots. They just don't have the same broadcast talent they used to have either. And with changes like this and declining viewership, they're not going to be able to hire better broadcast talent. It just is what it is. They're going to have a tough time saving it. And unfortunately, at this rate, last year we went from 10 teams to 8 teams. This next year we're going from 8 teams to 6 teams. So according to my calculations, we'll be back here making a video in 2027 officially announcing the death of the LCS as we move to 0 LCS teams. So I am not looking forward to that one, but I will be back in 2027 with that video for you guys. So good luck in solo queue and have a wonderful day. GG and rip the NA LCS.